Hello everybody, welcome along to this video. Mr. Johnson teaches the exposure revision, as you can see on the screen there. Of course, exposure is one of the 15 poems that you may have studied in your power and conflict cluster. This is literature paper 2 that we're talking about here, and as a little reminder, in that exam during section B you will be asked to choose a poem which you compare to the one that you've been given by the exam board. So they would choose one with a question, and then you choose a poem which you think best will help you answer that question that you can compare to the other poem. As always, you'll be needing to pause this video. You'll want to have pen, paper ready, because revision, as always, should be active. So make sure that you are actively revising whilst watching this video, and let's get started. If I can get the click working. Let's try again. Okay, make sure you've got a copy of the poem here as well. It's going to be absolutely essential that you have it in front of you. If you need to copy one off the internet or print one, then ideal, go for that. You'll also find it on BBC Bitesize, and I'll be referring to that website again throughout the video too. So again, if you haven't got a copy, pause this, get one ready now. And then let's move on. Just to say that I'm not going to read all the poem. If you need to hear it, so either read it to yourself now, or again, BBC Bitesize, they've got a great video on there of somebody reading it, very sort of melancholy and very glum, as you'd expect for this poem. Either way, pause this video again, read the poem to yourself, and then we'll move on with some revision. And let's do that. Right, a little bit about Wilfred Owen for you first, in case you weren't aware. So, as it says there's the dates he lived between. Now, the dates of the First World War were 1914 to 1918, and you might be able to see the two matching there. Wilfred Owen did die right before the end of the First World War. It's a really tragic story, which you can go off and find more about yourself, the circumstances around his death. But he did serve during the First World War, as that photo would suggest. I'd say he's perhaps our most famous war poet, among others, but he really is known, and his war poetry really is very famous. And I put there, he wasn't afraid to criticise the war, but also those in charge through his poetry. There's many good poems that he's written whilst he was in the trenches. That's the other thing to bear in mind here. Wilfred Owen was not a poet. That was not his job. He actually was a soldier, but like a number of soldiers, when they were there, he wrote poetry whilst he was in the trenches, under really difficult circumstances as well. So these poems come from the trenches, and that's really worth knowing. And also some context for you. The photograph there is from the Somme, as it says on the bullet points. The Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles during the First World War. Massive casualties as well. But also the weather was particularly terrible for the soldiers as well. Really cold weather, and it just made their suffering that much worse. You have to bear in mind that these soldiers were actually outside for a large amount of the time. They weren't going off into tents, they weren't going off into shelters. They largely were in the trenches when they were sleeping as well, so it made it really bad. So we're talking hypothermia, we're talking frostbite on top of the trench foot that they might be suffering from as well. And as it says on the second bullet point, Owen and his fellow soldiers forced to lie outside in these freezing conditions. He wrote there, "We were marooned in a frozen desert." It's a lovely oxymoron for you. A frozen desert, not a sign of life on the horizon, but 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of the cold. You'll want to pause this video, add some notes about Wilfred Owen to your page, but also just add a little bit of context. Knowing that this was going on whilst he was writing the poem that you're about to reread is really important. It sort of sets up the poem and maybe changes the way you understand it a little bit. Let's think about the title. Always think about the title of any poem that you read. It gives you a clue. Exposure. Now the word quite literally means to have something uncovered, to be outside. And I've put there like a connotation of that word. You could talk about exposure being vulnerable. If you are exposed, you haven't got any protection of any sort. So the title sort of instantly sets up the feel of the poem. And also you can die from exposure. It's a cause of death. If you're outside for too long in cold conditions and you haven't got the right sort of clothing, then you can actually die from that, and that would be called dying from exposure. So actually it's almost got connotations linked to death as well. Now I'm going to go through stanza by stanza. I'm not going to be able to say everything that it's ever possible to say in the time we've got, but be ready to make notes. You'll also find revision guides, have extra ideas you can look at. If you were to Google this poem with revision next to it, you'll find all sorts on YouTube as well, and also BBC Bitesize. Here are some of my key points that I would point out as essentials, things that you definitely would want to know about this poem. So let's start off with that first line. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. If something's merciless, it doesn't show mercy, it doesn't show any kindness, it doesn't stop. So if the winds are merciless and being described that way, with that adjective, then what you've got there is a bit of personification. The wind, in this case, and the weather is being personified as if it's attacking the soldiers. The winds that knife us, that verb there, to knife somebody, is again obviously really aggressive. It makes it sound like the weather is almost seeking them out, trying to kill them and find them deliberately. Have a look at the ends of those lines as well. You've got the ellipsis going on there, like he's almost trailing off, like he's not finishing. It almost sounds like they're tired, and they would be tired. The word wearied there on the second line means to be tired, because the night is silent. Listen in this stanza to all of the sibilants, all of these S sounds you've got going on there as well. You've got silent, flares, salient, silent, sentries, whisper, curious, nervous. This is no accident, very deliberate. Is it like they're so tired that they're slurring their words? You almost sound like you're drunk if you don't get enough sleep, like endless amounts of sleep. And that's maybe what it sounds like. It almost sounds aggressive to me as well, this sounds as well. Hissing almost. And then you get that repeated line of nothing happens. Look down your page, you'll notice that the stanzas are all equal. The structure of this poem almost mirrors the structure of their lives. Their lives are repeated. Their lives are almost the same. Having that structure of it being the same all the way through this poem almost mirrors what's going on in their lives as well. And then that last line, deliberately shorter, makes it stand out. It emphasises it to you, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. I think that's really gory, not gory, maybe not so much, but deathly, morbid, horrible imagery going on there. They're looking at the barbed wire, like in the picture there. The wind is blowing it, and they can almost picture like men being trapped in it. So instead of it the wind blowing the barbed wire, they're almost imagining you've got men, like the ghosts of men, tugging on the wire among its brambles. Twitching, and agonies is a really good word there as well. Agony is something which is an incredible amount of pain. And what they talk about in the next bit of the stanza there is almost there's the rumble of guns in the distance, but it's like there's another war going on and they're not part of it. They almost just feel like they're watching and waiting. And then you've got that rhetorical question, what are we doing here? Then you've got this one as well. Dawn begins to grow, like in the photo there. This grey army, this melancholy army, like rising in the east, almost like the days are getting ready to attack them as well. The second line, he talks about the rain soaks, the clouds sags stormy. Listen again, loads of sibilants going on there as well. Sags stormy. Again, very sort of horrible imagery going on there. These sort of dark clouds building. You could almost talk about like the foreshadowing of death coming on here. Absolutely be right if you could talk about the pathetic fallacy that you've got going on there, like the weather being used to reflect their mood. Look how the weather attacks once more in ranks of shivering, ranks of grey. Think about the connotations of grey. Again, that word melancholy could be used to apply there, and then there's the repeated line, but nothing happens. Loads of sibilants in this next, like almost they're in silence, and then suddenly a load of bullets just rattle off. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Yet, he says, they are less deadly than the air, which is filled and shudders, like almost shakes, black with snow. Real contrasting imagery there as well. Black with snow, this air. So again, the weather being the enemy here, because then you've got the alliteration of the flowing flakes that flock. They pause and then they renew, they start again, they start attacking the soldiers again. So again, the imagery of the weather being an enemy for them here. Nothing happens. Then you've got this imagery of blossoms. Now, blossoms are associated normally with new life. It's what you'll see around springtime growing on the trees, and yet the blossoms, when they drop and die, you could almost see it as an extended metaphor going on here for the soldiers and their lives. They are largely young soldiers, and yet they are also dying as well. They're in the spring of their lives. So I think that's something to really pay attention to here. You've got the first line, the pale flakes, fingering stealth, feeling for our faces. Loads of alliteration sounds there, but it also sounds really, it's personifying the snowflakes, making them sound really aggressive, really quite sinister, I would say you've got going on there as well. They're talking about their dreams. They're in holes, like waiting. They're dreaming about being sundozed, lying there with blossoms falling down. And then he asks the question, is it that we're dying? Is this dream just part of them slipping away into death? It's quite horrible, really. Oh, I've managed to cut off that first line there. What we've got there, it should say, slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires. So they're, again, almost like feeling of dying going on here as well, the idea of their ghosts. They talk about jewels and beautiful things, yet these beautiful things that they're imagining, think about jewels, are also very cold as well, cold, death-like perhaps as well. They've left the trenches, the mice rejoice, they're happy because the trenches are theirs because the soldiers are gone. Shutters and doors all closed on us, the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. It feels like they've almost been shut away from home. They're fighting in a foreign land here, don't forget as well. And it almost feels like they're so far away from home. Does anyone even realise that they're there? Have they forgotten about them and forgotten about the battle taking place? They talk about this, the idea of God here really is, and that particularly that last line, the love of God seems dying. Has God forgotten them? Has God turned his back on them? Have they turned their back on God? Have they given up on the idea of religion? How can they believe in religion when they see so much death and suffering taking place every day? It's really sort of very grim and melancholy feeling going on in that stanza particularly. And then we've got the final stanza going on here as well, talking once again about the weather. Tonight the frost will fasten on this mud. Like, listen, it almost like feels like the frost is coming for the mud and coming for them, shrivelling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. And then you've got the burying party, the soldiers in charge of burying the bodies. They've got their picks and shovels in their shaking grasp. They pause over these half-known faces. They sort of recognise these bodies. They're not too sure. All their eyes are ice. You have to ask yourself, whose eyes? The eyes of the bodies? Are they frozen? Are they cold? Or are the burying soldiers' eyes who are looking down at this turned to ice? Almost like they've lost all emotion. They've lost all care. That they, in fact, themselves are almost dying. They're not themselves anymore. They've had to become cold and hard to be able to deal with this horrible situation. And once again, but nothing happens. The repeated line. You can call that a refrain. R-E-F-R-A-I-N. You almost associate it with music. And there you go. That's gone through all of the lines there. Those are some questions. You're going to need to pause. I'm not going to have time to read through all of those, but those questions can help you reflect on your notes. Whenever you make notes, something like you might have written the word personification next to parts of your poem, but you always need to write down as well, why? Why does Owen want to, in this case, personify the weather? Why does he want to use sibilance, alliteration? Write down to yourself what effect it has. And again, BBC Bitesize and other sources might help you with those ideas if you can't think of them yourself. Then moving on to the final bit. A pair paragraph, a response to a question which I've put down there. How does Owen explore the impact of conflict on soldiers? In a moment I'll show you my final slide where you can pause and have a look at an example paragraph I've written for you on how I go about that. Your next bit, because that's always the next stage for you guys, is what do you do with your revision? Have a go at answering that question yourself. I would point you towards writing about the melancholy tone of the poem. The fact that resigned, by resigned I mean he almost feels like he's given up and is ready for death. They feel like that is something inevitable that's going to happen to them. Or you could talk about his use of sibilance. It's really unusual using sibilance in a poem about war, which you'd expect to be very strong, violent, angry, maybe plosive sounds. Instead, what you've got here is the sibilance, the soft sounds. Why? Why might he choose to do that? Why might he have that juxtaposition between sibilance and soft sounds and a very hard situation that these soldiers are in? This is my example paragraph answering that question which I've just given to you. You've got your 4 stages in the different colours. Follow those. When you do your example paragraph, absolutely use my sentence starters that I've got there as well. My first bit, I'm telling the examiner I understand what is going on in this poem. I'm not retelling the story, but I am actually almost putting into my own words the impact on the soldiers and showing I understand that. Then I name a method. That's my second blue sentence. Absolutely always make sure you do that. I've tried to embed my quote on the green bit. Then in the red bit, I've done some analysis. I've unpicked keywords, but I've added the word also in there as well. I've tried to add a second interpretation. And finally, almost most importantly, where you pick up marks, the purple bit, you understanding what effect it has on the reader and also what Wilfred Owen was trying to teach us. I'm out of time, so I'm going to say good luck to you when it comes to your exams, and thank you for listening. Bye bye.